welcome to today's session of the Wednesday afternoon coffee break. We are discussing a really exciting topic, unlike some of the other topics we've discussed, like Corporate Transparency Act. We're going to talk about a real exciting topic called AI issues and how it's going to affect your business. Everyone knows that AI is in the headlines. Everywhere you look, there's comments about AI. There's articles about AI. There's new AI programs coming out to change your voice and create, video content and streamline your work product. So we're going to talk today a little bit about what some of those concerns are in implementing them into your business and where we may need to have a little guidance. So since I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert on this topic, we have brought Taylor Gast in, who is a member of our business and corporate practice group and is my go-to IT guy when it comes to issues like data security, data privacy, breaches, anything like that. And we have also brought in today Lindsey Mead, who is a new colleague at our firm, joined up, I think this is now your first full year as she came back from her summer associate. We didn't scare her away, or more importantly, Taylor Gast didn't scare you away. So we're really happy to have you both here today for today's Wednesday afternoon coffee break session on AI.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah. So first, let's kind of throw out what we're dealing with today. We know that AI has been a really hot topic, as we've discussed, from a legal perspective, and again, from a real high-level overview. When you have conversations with organizations that are thinking about AI or those types of issues, what background information regarding AI do you think is most important?
Yeah, so it's interesting because we are increasingly having quite a volume of conversations about artificial intelligence, and clients and potential clients, organizations that come into these conversations are coming in a variety of different positions. Some of them are extremely high-tech, sophisticated business organizations that are creating some of the AI models or heavily integrating some of the AI models and services that are out there. And they have deep concerns about how do we appropriately use AI on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we have relatively less technical organizations that are starting to see, for example, maybe employees beginning to use AI and a little bit of concern about, well, what if we don't want our employees to maybe use AI blindly? And one thing that I've noticed, and one thing that I've started trying to level set on in a conversation about AI increasingly is, what do we mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Because it's become apparent that almost nobody is talking about the same thing when we're talking about artificial intelligence. We all have this picture, right? And 5 to 10 years ago, we were thinking about like the Terminator, the movie The Terminator, or something like the machines are rising up against us or something. Now it's a little more nuanced and it's a little more technical, but we're still very varied on exactly what that means. And so it's useful to think about the definition. What do we mean when we're talking about AI? Are we talking about, I'll throw a few terms out. Are we talking about generative AI, for example? That's a very commonplace, typical, definitional item that we might actually mean when we're saying AI. We might mean generative AI, and generative AI is typically an artificial intelligence model or service that most often it functions based on prompts. So like a little chat, like a comment place where you can type in, hey, draft me an email that is to this type of person and includes a summary of this information, or whatever you instruct the model to do. generative AI. And that might not just be text-based, it might be photos or videos or all sorts of things. But oftentimes even generative AI as an assumption is misguided because we might be talking not about generative AI. We might be talking, for example, about something that's more automation based. It might be something that connects behind the scenes two parts of a business together, so that the business or the organization can be more efficient. So for example, every time, one of our customer service folks gets this request to update this record, we often forget that we also need to update some other record or some other part of the business.
Yeah.
And you could create an AI service or an AI model that helps with the automation of that. So what I want to emphasize here is, there's the definition of AI is extremely broad potentially, and backing us into a standardized definition would be far longer than we might even have time here. But coming into the conversation, thinking about the fact that the technology has grown so quickly and so significantly that we need to think about what are we talking about at the front end is a really good thing to be considering. And whether you're considering what conversation do I need to have with my lawyer, what issues do I need to be worried about, what are my employees doing, what's the business doing, etc. So definitions, good thing to think about there.
Well, and with that in mind, once you kind of establish, the definition, you start to have the conversation about AI, what's going to be implemented, how it's going to be implemented, right? How are you seeing organizations using AI right now? You talked about some of the examples that are there, and what kind of value and benefits are organizations seeing? And also, I mean, conversely, what are some of the issues that they're running into, right? Obviously, there needs to be some sort of benefit to invest in this technology, right? But as with everything, there's always some cons that are there. So,
yeah, we're seeing AI tools either be purchased or licensed, or even businesses themselves developing them in-house. So how AI then intersects with the business is going to really heavily depend on the industry and what type of business we're talking about. But in general, Taylor and I are seeing a lot of businesses commend AI tools for being able to create new products and services and dive these businesses into new markets, optimize their internal practices with employees, and then also combine the automated process that AI tools bring with human effort to hopefully, the goal is to reduce the human error that can come up in certain types of roles. But of course, with that comes a lot of potential risks. And we're seeing in general, people lack trust of how these AI tools and algorithms make their decisions, which is a grounded concern and reputational concerns for a lot of businesses with how optics and marketing might impact, their clientele looking in if they choose to broadcast that they've implemented a new AI tool into their business practices. And as Taylor kind of mentioned with the Terminator example, there's also this fear that AI tools are going to completely replace humans in the workforce or take over certain roles. And then also, as Taylor mentioned, the bias and the hallucination or misleading and incorrect results that AI tools can put out. So you can't always trust how that algorithm is making those choices. So yeah, overall, I think the biggest concern, and with this space being ever evolving, is liability. And it's unknown whether the AI tool itself can be held liable in some way, whether the company that's inputting this tool into their business is liable, or whether the creator of the tool is liable, the person inputting results to get that output. It's a mess in that space.
You see that in autonomous driving all the time, right? Who's actually responsible? Is it the computer that didn't press the brake, or is it the person behind the scenes and or excuse me, behind the steering wheel? And we have this legacy body of law that's out there that I don't think ever contemplated AI. And to your point, we have to figure out how to integrate it. And you really brought up an interesting point, which is also the optics of it, right? I briefly consulted actually about a year back with a client who wanted to put in, they do like assembly of small parts, and they got pitched on this AI concept. They put cameras above all their employees to monitor workflow, to make sure that things are being done right. And it caused a huge amount of backlash within the employees. They felt that every single second they're being monitored, right? And literally the camera standing right over them. It had some unintended consequences that I don't think were really valued at the time, or at least evaluated at the time. So you bring up some really good points about that.
It's interesting, Rob, because I often, as we're speaking with clients about artificial intelligence related issues, I'm often struck by this strangely not new feeling. I'm struck by the idea that the issues that are raised by this very novel technology and something that's developing and evolving so quickly is raising these actually really old, basic issues that we've been confronting for a long time. I mean, right, like if we didn't have in the situation you're mentioning, if we didn't have an AI model underneath that camera system,
Mm-hmm.
the same organization might be thinking, well, maybe we could hire somebody who could keep an eye on what's going on, make some notes, draft a report, and we could talk about how to improve efficiency. And that's maybe the entire point. It's the same thing. And we'd have the same exact conversation about,
Yeah.
hey, the employees don't love that there's a camera right above them. It's this, it's the same thing. It's just now it's so much easier to throw that out
Yeah.
into the workplace or
Mm-hmm.
into a business model. And the value proposition has been so vetted in a lot of cases because we can say organization A, B, C, D, E, we have the direct numbers. Here's exactly what our consulting, if it's another business bringing it in, or a vendor bringing it in. Here's what happened, and here's the value. Great,
Yeah.
looks helpful. Let's make sure we're looking at this from every angle, of
Correct.
course, before we get there though. And it's interesting to know.
Yeah, and you bring up that trust issue, right? Again, someone looking over my shoulder, I don't like, but at least I can converse with them. At least I can explain it to them, right? I have an understanding that most people will act reasonably, right? When it's an AI tool, you always have this feeling of, well, how do I challenge it if it's wrong, right? And we don't understand as much. I mean, I'm sure there's some tech people that do, right? But we don't understand as much, the manner in which it's making its decision, and that just breeds, fear and concern, right? And I'm certainly not saying that it's unwarranted, right? But those are certainly issues that need to be brought up. And you also talk very briefly, and it's one of my favorite stories because it shows some of the issues with AI. I think it was an attorney in New York just got sanctioned by the bar. He used a generative AI tool for a pretty important brief that made up a whole bunch of fictional law, right? Sounded great in the brief, right? But he didn't go through and actually check it, right? It's the same example that we have with the self-driving car, right? Who's ultimately responsible? Guess what? The AI tool wasn't the one who had his or her bar card, potentially punched for that, right? Again, there's this lack of trust, there's the lack of understanding, and some AI tools are better than others, I have to imagine. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think um, to my mind, one of the most important underlying issues here is something that Lindsay mentioned a minute ago, which is this concept of liability and who's responsible. And it's also that idea kind of cuts through and flows through so much that we talk about with our clients and just that I know businesses are thinking about, and it applies to, again, it would apply regardless whether we have a person behind the camera or a machine behind the camera. And it's interesting having a number of these conversations because we talk with organizations interested in incorporating AI meaningfully into the businesses or operations.
Yeah.
Something as simple as either, hey, we just want to use a really simple AI service to generate our social media posts, or something much more involved, like we're an insurer and we want to evaluate the strength of claims or the potential for fraud for the claims that we have in front of us. And the liability concept there cuts through all of this, right? Who is responsible for the decision that's being made? That is the ultimate and an extremely important question that we are finding ourselves talking about a lot, and are sometimes finding is underappreciated, kind of maybe to my surprise, because my feeling is that we need to have a very clear decision on who's responsible for the decisions of the artificial intelligence service. And if it's something as simple as you're going to use ChatGPT to generate the text used on your Facebook posts, I'm probably not the most concerned about that as a basic premise. There are issues that we should talk about, but as long as we can get comfortable with the idea that you're responsible for the content, you can't point the finger at ChatGPT for saying that whatever your supplement is going to cure some disease that it hasn't been vetted by the FDA to do, right? You have to be responsible for the outputs.
Yeah.
Except for circumstances where we have a vendor or we have a relationship such that we have a clear assignment of liability that's in a written agreement, and that we feel very comfortable about the language there. And that's something that the vendor or whomever is on the other end is assuming that risk, and that's the whole point of the relationship.
Yeah.
We see vendor relationships like that all the time, but what we don't want is to have a relationship where on either side there's confusion about who's responsible. And that's a really important discussion that needs to be had.
And you kind of segue into an issue that we should talk about, which is, are there specific laws, rules, regulation, guidance, things like that organizations should be thinking about it? And again, setting aside the fact that, AI, however you use AI, is going to trigger, downstream waterfall of regulations, right? If I, use AI to, direct traffic, well, I also have to think about traffic laws, right? Things like that, right? But when we focus on, the AI itself, what kind of things are out there that that organizations should be thinking of when they're looking at these types of AI solutions?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I think folks should be thinking about here. And I want to throw out kind of a general thought, and then I want to leave some space here for Lindsey's perspective, because she's done a great job and has helped us out with sort of tracking the direction of proposed, pending, recent legislation, whether new or whether proposed or passed. And I think in a space like this where the laws and regulations are so new and at best are trying to catch up with the direction that the development of the technology, it almost seems to me to be more important to keep abreast of pending legislation. But for the sake of course, thinking about what actually currently applies to folks, I'd say that there is a very scattered, piecemeal, patchwork version of laws and regulations that are out there that apply depending on the industry that the organization is in, and depends on exactly what we're doing with the particular artificial intelligence service. One area that I end up talking a lot about, because it's an area that I focus my practice on, is data privacy, for example. And the whole point of some of these artificial intelligence models is to feed a massive amount of data into the model, teach the model to make decisions or to spit out a result that we like, and use the data that we fed it to produce a result that the company is happy, the organization is on board with, basically. And we need, in those cases, to think about whether we're comfortable and we have the appropriate level of consent to feed all of that information into the model, for example. So, you know, the basic recommendation here is don't throw sensitive employee or customer information into, you know, an AI model that needs to be trained without ensuring that the proper protections are in place, and we're following our privacy policy, we're following our customer agreements, et cetera, if that's the context. But we certainly want to be thinking about those risks. There are other analogous risks that apply in other circumstances, and also in other geographies. If we have customers in other countries, this gets maybe potentially a little more complicated. But the landing point here is to say that we don't have too much yet that is sort of a purely, this is an AI statute, for example. We do have some automated decision-making related statutes. So if we're making, you know, legally significant decisions about insurance coverage or health coverage, or again, you know, things that would affect a credit score, for example, and you're doing that on an automated basis. Basically, if we're making a legally significant decision about a consumer, an individual in particular, we want to pause and think for a moment about that. Beyond that, there's a little less in terms of firmed up, finalized, in place, and effective legislation. But like I said, I think we want to hear also from Lindsey on some of the proposed, the direction of proposed authority as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it kind of ties into a best practice idea, or like things to keep in mind that you actually can apply right now, because though there's not an overarching federal law, there's a lot of principles or like key themes that come up in a lot of these state-based regulations, or like, for example, President Biden's executive order in October of last year referenced a lot of these. So he had the White House's Office of Science and Technology develop an AI Bill of Rights, which is supposed to then inspire rulemakers and regulators at different state levels and different agencies to keep these in mind as they promote, you know, the development of guidelines. And those include safety for safe and effective systems, protection from AI algorithms and discrimination, but also keeping children in mind. A lot of notice requirements for minors are popping up in these AI guidelines, data privacy, like Taylor said, and from a cybersecurity perspective. And then notice and reporting, just encouraging, if you're going to develop AI tools, transparency with what information they're collecting from end users and where that information is then stored. And in general, they have wanted to highlight that industry should be mindful to not replace humans with AI tech. So coming up with alternatives or ways for both to operate in tandem is key right now.
Yeah, I'm assuming that there's a no Skynet rule somewhere in these regulations. You know,
yeah. I would also underscore the idea that if we're building our business around or significantly incorporating an artificial intelligence service or model or use case, there is a business case for trying to at least work within the spirit of some of the principles that Lindsay just mentioned. Because if we don't, right, we might be, a year or two, like it's going to take a while before we have too much that's meaningful in this space, if it honestly ever comes about. But if it doesn't, then it's going to turn into state, a more complicated version of a state patchwork of laws and regulations. And if we don't at least acknowledge the principles that, again, transparency, consent to use important information, things of that nature while we're developing our business, we don't want to run into a brick wall once legislation comes down the pike and we have to have a hard conversation about how do we make this work? Can we make this work? That's, just don't want to be in a position to have that conversation.
So other than, the obvious, if someone is considering, implementing an AI, that they should, reach out to counsel and, specifically you guys to discuss some of those risks, what would you recommend as the key takeaways for folks wanting to stay on top of AI, integrate these systems into their business practices, and again, make sure to set themselves up for success, as the legal landscape regarding all of these AI systems is, constantly evolving. And I assume that there's no silver bullet, but what would be the best practices for something like that?
Yeah, I know Taylor has a list that we've kind of come up with together of things that people can keep in mind right now, but just in general, trying to stay on top of these pending legislative movements, guidelines, regulations is important. And if, your business feels as though you cannot, seeking other people or creating like a committee or team, somebody in the business that can is going to be crucial, because like Taylor said, if you're operating internationally, there's different concerns. If you're only operating in the state of Michigan, there's different concerns. And California is a huge state actor making probably quicker movements than other states with AI guidelines. So if you do business there, the considerations are going to be different.
Yeah, I would say the most important few kind of things to think through, actionable kind of actions wise here, would be, it depends on the business. So let's think about how we intersect with AI. But if we're incorporating AI as a service or as a key part of what we're doing or providing, certainly let's run a compliance review on the industry we're in and make sure there isn't an applicable law we need to be working within. Let's think about whether an internal AI policy is a good idea. And it might be a good idea if we're worried about employees using AI in a way that we're, again, concerned about. One, just as an quick aside, I would mention, if we're a business with meaningful trade secrets or other meaningful intellectual property, let's be very careful about who is putting what into AI services that are publicly available. So I would really like to make sure that our organizations are not dropping trade secrets into ChatGPT, for example, and potentially impliedly losing trade secret protection by doing so. That is a legitimate risk that we need to think about. And so maybe we need to tell employees, are you allowed to use these services or are you not? And if you are, how? And that's the kind of thing that a policy and some training is good for. Depending again on how we're using AI, if we have a third-party vendor or contractor that's working with us on this, let's take a really close look at the contract. Let's make sure that risk allocation is done in a mindful and logical way. And similarly, if we're going to have an ongoing vendor relationship, and especially if there's any meaningful data flows going on here, or any risk at all, really, let's run at least a little bit of diligence on that vendor and make sure we're vetting them and their information practices. So we know, for example, they're not shipping your data off to another country and using it for absolutely any purpose that they want to, without restriction, for example. So a few things to keep in mind. And there are many more. There are a number of areas that I don't think we've gone down the rabbit hole on, at least. So, certainly happy to answer any questions if any folks have questions, whether here or as follow-up, certainly. I know that's probably the same for Lindsey as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up the policy, and I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to share it with everyone because I've had you help some of my clients with it, right? Getting a policy together is something that you can help people with, correct?
Yeah,
Discussing,
absolutely.
how we're going to implement these things, how we're going to, check these things. These are conversations that should be happening on a fairly ongoing basis with your inside counsel. So,
Yeah,
absolutely.
conversation piece of that is super key. My feeling, at least, is the most important part of that, because frankly, we have, form documents that we start from for a policy like this at this point. We've had enough of these conversations that we aren't reinventing the wheel and drafting a brand new policy every time. But it intentionally, the form document starts relatively broadly, so intentionally, so that we can sit down and say, are we doing this? Are we concerned about that? How are we actually meaningfully using this so that we can help you spot issues, and you guys the internal folks can prompt conversations about what are we concerned about here? How are we using AI? How do we think we might be using it? And what needs to happen in order to protect the business and allow for the efficiencies and value that AI really brings to the table, basically.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both for your time. This is an evolving area, and I'm sure we're going to have you back to discuss, some of the new laws, some of the new regulations as they get passed, along with some of the new products that we see. The one thing that I know with absolute certainty, AI doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So it's just getting larger. So as those capabilities increase, we'll see some new products, and new products bring new risks and new regulations and new concerns for businesses before they can bring those in. So Taylor, Lindsey, I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your day to speak with us on this topic. A quick reminder to everyone, we have our next session on April 10th. We're going to be joined by a member of our Employment Services Practice Group to discuss the recent Department of Labor final rule concerning classification of independent contractors. This is, the tranche, are you an employee or are you an independent contractor? And as with most things in life, it is about as clear as mud. So we're going to talk about that new rule. It's going to address some of the details of the final rule, along with some recommendations of how employers should respond to the requirements within that final rule in order to do their best to avoid any type of misclassification penalties, which can always be a significant concern for any business. So again, Taylor, Lindsey, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on our Wednesday coffee break session, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And if you do have any questions regarding any AI, we do strongly encourage you to reach out to Taylor and Lindsey. Their information is found in the chat. And I have to suspect that there's a couple AI resources on Foster Swift's webpage here and there. So again, thank you everyone for your time today, and have a fantastic week.